Hello everybody and welcome to another video on the Fly From Home Flight Simulation channel. I'm Kittykami and today I've got something a little bit different for all of you. First of all, I'm in the aircraft on my own today, no parental supervision from Jimbo, the seat is empty and there is definitely nobody sitting on that side. You'll also notice I've taken over the captain's responsibilities and I'm sitting on the left. And the more observant of you will of course have also noticed, if you're watching very, very carefully, that I'm not in a Dash 8 today. I'm actually in a light aircraft. It's actually this rather lovely looking Piper Arrow 2, or sorry, Piper Arrow 3 by Just Flight. So this is a single engine piston complex aircraft that you've probably, if you're familiar with GA airfields, you've probably seen a lot of these knocking around. They're a very, very common aircraft, both for touring round and visiting different airfields. The sort of GA community really like these aeroplanes, but also it is a very important aeroplane for the flight training community, because a lot of aircraft which are used in the role as commercial pilot's license training aircraft are these. They have to be complex. You can't use a simple type, that is fixed landing gear and fixed prop. You have to have retractable landing gear and variable pitch prop, which we have in this aircraft. And seeing as it's common and they still make it even today, I think it's first started being produced in the late 60s, correct me if I'm wrong, and it's still in production today, so easy to get parts for, lots of them produced. You can pick them up relatively cheaply for a light aircraft. They are surprisingly expensive depending on what they've got fitted to them and how old the engines are. But suffice to say, it's become a staple of flying schools all around the world, and certainly in the UK, where I'm familiar with. Now, this particular example that we've got here is a pretty good representation of most flying school aeroplanes. It's a little bit beaten up. The controls have seen a fair old few sweaty hands gripping on to the sides there. All the paint's worn off them. There's a bit of mud and grass and stuff in the carpet. It's a really good representation, really. This aeroplane, it's about £30, I think, from the Just Flight store. It sounds a bit expensive, really, for a light aircraft, but honestly, when you look at the level of detail that it is, it's kind of worth it, really. So if you are in the market for a single-engine piston aeroplane for P3D or for X-Plane, I think it's for X-Plane as well, go over there and grab it. It's a good addition to your flight sim hangar. So, where are we today? Well, a little bit of a change of scenery. I thought we'd go somewhere different today, so we've done Birmingham to death. So we're at Doncaster today, Doncaster Sheffield Airport, a little bit further north. EGCN, for those of you who want the ICAO code. We're sat at holding point Charlie for runway 02, that's in use today. And the point of today's exercise is we're going to be just flying some circuits, really. It's not going to be particularly in-depth. I'm not going to be going into pressing buttons and talking about all sorts of different speeds and stuff too much. It's just going to be a basic circuit technique of what you would see on a conversion course, if you were doing a conversion course from simple single-engine piston to complex, or indeed if you were starting your commercial pilot's license. The particular company I work for, you'd be doing circuit details at the start of the course to familiarise yourself with the aircraft, because presumably you'd probably not flown a complex aircraft before. You've probably been flying around in a simple type aircraft as you've been doing your hour building. And then you've got to move on to this, which is, to be fair, it's a fair bit of a step up over, certainly over a little very light SEP like a Cessna 150 or a 152. This is a fair bit more beefy. Got 200 horsepower in the front, which is quite a lot really from a 4-cylinder Lycoming engine. I've got a 3-blade constant speed propeller, hydraulically actuated landing gear, and that's about it really. It's basically a Piper Cherokee or Archer with a bit more beef under the bonnet and retractable landing gear. It flies pretty much the same really. It's quite heavy on the controls compared to the regular Cherokee, but certainly the Archer is a little bit closer. You might sort of notice it's a touch on the heavy side when you first start flying it, but once you get used to it, it's the same thing. It just kind of drops out the sky a fair bit quicker, and that's the main thing to get used to. So before I start waxing lyrical about aeroplanes for the next 3 hours, let's crack on with this, shall we? So we're sat at holding point Charlie, as mentioned, and what I've got to do first of all is the pre-takeoff vital actions that we'd be doing right before we rolled onto the runway. So I always remember this with an acronym. Remember, aviation is full of annoying acronyms, and this is a really useful one for remembering all your bits and pieces. You can even do these bits and pieces if you're flying a large sort of heavy commercial aircraft, because they all apply. So assuming we've been given our clearance to depart or line up, let's assume it's depart. So I'd be sitting here and I'd say Doncaster Tower, Golf Tango Echo Bravo Zulu, ready for departure, holding point Charlie. They'd come back and let's say they give us a line up and wait. So line up and wait, runway 02, Golf Bravo Zulu. So line up and wait, runway 02, Golf Bravo Zulu, park brake off, and start rolling forwards. And as we're doing that should have been on already, actually, my mistake. That's the fuel pump there. That should have been put on with the pre-flight checks, the power checks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check left and right. So approach path, A. T for transponder, so the transponder goes to mode Charlie. Pitot heats and lights. I'll miss the center line completely while I'm doing that. Giving a great representation of my skills as a pilot here, aren't I? Okay, I'll grab us on the center line. I'm just going to check the wind very quickly. I'm going to hold it on the brakes while we do that. RPM 1200, we always ground idle the engine to help keep the air-cooled engine, so keep the air flowing through it, and also stop the spark plugs from fouling up too much. So the wind is variable at 5 knots, beautiful, so there's no wind to worry about pretty much. It's kind of swinging around a little bit. So we'll keep the controls in the center. We'll ramp the power up a touch. Just check our T's and P's. They're all looking in the green and good. I'm going to get rid of the yoke just so I can see the RPM and manifold pressure gauge a little bit better. Now release the brakes and smoothly push the power forward. Bit of right pedal to hold the center line as the speed starts to build. 40 knots, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, that's rotate. Gently back on the yoke. We pitch initially for 80 knots, 79, which is about the same climb speed as a regular PA-28. Just going to bug runway heading to make that a little bit easier for me. Insufficient runway remaining. Touch the brakes, gear up. And 25 on the manifold pressure gauge, 2500 RPM on the prop gauge there. And we allow the aircraft to accelerate to 90 knots now for a clean climb. Keep that right pedal in to counteract the propeller slipstream. Quick look out the right hand side of the aircraft to check visually there's no traffic in the way, and then right hand turn, maintaining 90 knots, around about a 25-degree angle of bank onto crosswind, coming up to 1,000 feet, which is our circuit height. We're on the QNH today, but airfield elevation at Doncaster is just 50 feet, so we don't really need to add too much for that. So we'll pitch down to level off. As we're doing that, I'm also going to bring the power back to about 18 inches and the prop RPM to about 2,300. That should keep us in the ballpark of about 100 knots. We're doing about 110 at the moment, which is just a touch fast. You don't want to be going around the circuit too quickly, otherwise things are going to happen a little bit too rapidly for you to keep up with. Certainly as student pilots, I always recommend student pilots try to fly the circuit about 100 knots, both to try and stay ahead of the aeroplane a little bit themselves, and also because most other light GA traffic is going to be around about 100 knots as well. All of your Cessnas and your Pipers and things like that will be flying around the circuit at that sort of speed, plus or minus 10 knots. So coming around to the right now, look out beforehand and take up the runway reciprocal heading 200. See the airport now on our right. Maintaining 1,000 feet. As we come past the runway thresholds, 420, the opposite end, I'd be making my radio call to tower, so I'd be calling in and saying Golf Bravo Zulu, downwind, runway 02, touch and go. And he'd probably come back with report final number 1 and respond with report final number 1, Golf Bravo Zulu. And at that point, I'd start running through my pre-landing checks. So the pre-landing checks on this aircraft, or at least the ones that my company uses, are brakes checked and pressurized. The parking brake is off. Undercarriage select down. Mixture's full rich. Mags are on both. Fuel will change the tanks now. Fuel pump is on. Pressure is sufficient. Flaps will go 1 stage of flaps. Instruments, check your DIs are still aligned. Carb heat we don't have in this aircraft because it's fuel injected, but we'll just cycle the alternate air and make sure there's no fluctuation in manifold pressure. Hatches and harnesses all secure, so you check your seat belt, and you also check the hatch over this side and make sure that's all secure. And landing light, and landing light's remaining on because we're still in the circuit. I always keep it on below 1,000 feet in a light aircraft anyway. So as you can see, the speed's now come back to 90 knots. So that's lovely. That's about the right sort of speed window we want to be in at this point. The gear, I've not really touched the throttle at all. I've just allowed the extra drag from the gear to bring the speed back for us. And I'm just checking over my right hand shoulder. I'm looking for the threshold of runway 02. And it's around about there in the sort of 45 degree over my right hand shoulder. I'm going to take that as my cue to turn in for base leg. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Arrow tends to drop out of the sky quite hard, unlike a lot of lighter SEPs, single engine piston aircraft. So we don't have to be too aggressive on our height management because it's very easy to drop this plane out of the sky. But for the benefit of, let's assume we've got some nervous passengers on board, and let's anticipate the descent a little bit so we can maintain a nice gentle descent down in the circuit. We're aiming to be about 700 feet, between 600 and 700 feet on the base to final turn, so we'll judge it for that. We'll also start to bring the speed back towards 85 knots. So I'm just going to reduce the throttle slightly and also raise the nose just a touch. And as you can see, very quickly the speed comes back down. Normally I'd be considering where the wind's coming from on the base to final turn. If the wind's coming from the outside of you turn early. If it's coming from the inside, you turn... Correction, if the wind's from the outside of you turn late. If it's coming from the inside of you turn early to compensate for that. But we don't really know where the wind's coming from today because it's variable, so we'll just kind of guess it around about there. That's pretty much the centre line. Speed's coming back to 80 now. That's perfect for the initial part of the approach, adjusting the trim. Go flaps 2. Usually go flap 2 on base leg, but I kept it off that time. And we'll go full flap. Golf Bravo Zulu, final runway 02, touch and go. And presumably we'd be cleared for touch and go at that point. Bringing the speed back to 75 now. Reds, blues, and 3 greens. That's the final pre-landing check. Touch fast, touch low. Final third of the descent, so I'm going to start bringing the speed back towards 70 knots now. That's good. One of the advantages of this aircraft, it generally takes a pretty nose-low attitude at all stages of flight, so you have quite good visibility over the front. Coming down, getting into the ground effect now, floating a little bit. Start to feather the power off. Just hold it off the runway. There we go. Flaps up. And full power selectors. And off we go again. And we've got full length in front of us this time instead of just under a kilometre from taxiway Charlie. So I'm not going to tuck the gear up straight away. I'm going to wait until I'm confident that the aircraft's not going to have an engine failure. If it's have an engine failure straight after takeoff, I don't want my gear retractor, because then I'm making a belly landing. If the gear's down, then I can just pop it straight back down on the runway on the wheels, and there's no damage to report, hopefully. Quick look out the window, you can see the terminals and the hangars going by underneath us there, so that pretty much indicates we are clear of any usable runway. So we're going to retract the gear now and pitch down very slightly. Retracting the gear will allow the aircraft to accelerate in itself, so you don't need to pitch too much. And there we go, there's 90 knots, barely any change in pitch. I'm completely forgetting the level off. There's 1,000 feet. We'll start our turn to the right now. Back off the power and come back on the RPM as well. And we'll come straight back to our 2300 since we've already leveled up. 2525 is climb power and fast cruise. Circuit setting is around about 2318 in most arrows. Depends, really. I mean, they're all different because they're all so old at this point. Some of them are a lot faster than others. The better ones that I've flown will easily sit at 140 knots all day long at 2525. While some struggle to break 125, 130 knots. So it all depends on your own aircraft, really. In real life, of course. In the simulator, we've got an ideal representation, so this one should be performing to book figures. So I'll try and get this one leveled out. So for the second circuit we're going to go for a flapless approach. So we've bunged 5 knots on our approach speeds for this, so we're going to be touching down at 75 instead of 70. Which is going to mean a flatter approach, lower nose attitude on touchdown, potentially, if we let it touch down early. So we don't want to let it touch down early. A lot of PA-28 pilots tend to land their aeroplanes flat, from what I've seen, just because the tendency to try and add a bit of extra speed to smooth out the landing, and as a result they end up bashing their nose wheel on the ground. So to avoid that, what we're going to do is we are going to come in faster, but when we're over the runway, we're going to chop that throttle and hold it off and prevent it from touching down too early. But you may notice that the approach, the attitude from the airplane is more kind of nose high, but the approach is flatter. That's what I was trying to get at. So on downwind again, so we're making our radio call. Downwind touch and go. And again, we're going to do our pre-landing checks. So brakes are pressurized and parking brake is off. Undercarriage is down. Mixture, fuel, flat we don't need this time. Instruments are all good, and in the green on here. Carpet we don't have, but we'll cycle this. Hatches and harnesses are still secure, and the landing light is on. One of the awkward things about flying VFR stuff in Flight Simulator is your view control is quite limited, I've found. If any of you got those fancy track IR things, I'm sure it's not a problem for you. But sadly, I'm still in the Stone Age using hat switches and stuff. Okay, that looks like the right point for base. Now in real life, of course, you can use landmarks and stuff in the circuit if you're familiar with the circuit to mark out where your base leg and your downwind leg should be going. I try to avoid teaching students to rely on that, just because you're not always going to be at your home airfield. You can't always rely on landmarks that you know. So for the flapless approach, just because we've got a little bit less drag available than on the standard one, I'm going to start feathering the power back early. I'm going to slow down before I go down, just bring the power back and pitch the aircraft to maintain altitude initially until I've got about 85 knots. And then I'm going to allow that nose to come down. The gear is still providing a reasonably large amount of drag, so I don't expect I'm going to struggle too much with this, but it's there. We'll take the measures just in case we need them. Yeah, we're plenty high by the looks of things, but the turn will increase our rate of descent, so I'm confident we should be okay by the time we come around the turn. Okay, there's our runway. Still looking a little bit high, that's fine. Let's pull that power back. We'll do reds, blues and greens. The finer prop pitch will give us some more drag too. Golf Bravo Zulu final 02 touch and go. .80 knots initially for the flapless approach. Got a little bit of crosswind from the right by the looks of things. Pappy's coming in. We're aiming for the numbers, not the touchdown points, so the Pappy's not a huge amount of use as we come into the final stage of the touchdown. I'm just going to start feathering the speed back to 75 now. Let it come down. Start to use corner of your windscreen to judge the distance with the ground. Bring that power back. And as I said, don't allow it to touch down flat. Keep that nose nice and high. There we go. Okay, flaps are up. T's and P's are in the green. Let's go full power. I'm going to add a little bit of correction to the right, just because I think we're getting a little bit of right crosswind. Okay, so yeah, maintaining the center line with the rudder pedals, pushing the speed climb, rotate 65. Bring the nose gently up, pitch to maintain 80 knots. Just hold it there for now, waiting for that point where we run out of runway remaining. There we go, we'll get the gear up now. And we'll select the manifold pressure to 25 inches, prop to 2500 RPM. And continue the climb straight ahead, maintaining runway heading as best we can. Wind's a little bit all over the place. Okay, we're climbing away clean now, approaching 1,000 feet, so I'm going to pitch down to level off, and around about the same time I'm just going to start the turn onto the downwind leg. So this time we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to attempt, and I say the word attempt in bold italics, a glide approach. So a glide approach basically simulates an engine failure at the end of the downwind leg, and it assesses the student's ability to glide the airplane and manage the energy of the aircraft, basically, to get it on the ground if that situation were to occur in real life. So you might notice I'm turning continuously all the way around onto downwind. That's because I'll always try to be as close as possible to the runway for a glide approach when I know one's coming up. So if Mr. Examiner had told me, right, next one round it's a glide approach to land, this is the sort of position I'd want to put the aircraft in. Coming abeam the bars, so we'll let air traffic know. Golf Bravo Zulu, downwind runway 02 to land, glide approach. And assuming he's going to say that's approved report final number 1, that's fine. So we'll do our pre-landing checks. So brakes are pressurized, undercarriage we're going to defer, mixture's full rich, mags are on both. Fuel, we'll change tanks. Flaps we're going to defer. Instruments are all in the green and looking good. Carb heat we don't have, but we can turn that on and off to make sure we've got no fluctuation. Hatches and harnesses secure, landing lights on, and by that time we're pretty much coming around the end of the runway, and that is going to be our point at which we are going to kill the power and simulate our engine failure. So I'm going to pitch immediately up to the aircraft's best glide speed of 80 knots, and then pitch and trim to maintain. Trim that out. It's going to make your life a lot easier later on if you've got the proper trim settings straight away. And the real aircraft, I'll be looking out the right-hand side, constantly judging the position of the runway as best I could. Obviously, it's a little bit tricky from this viewpoint. And as soon as I catch sight of the runway again, there it comes, there we go. So, I'm going to constantly be asking myself the question, can I make that runway? And I think the answer is yes. So I'm going to go gear down at this point, which is going to add drag to the aircraft, so I'm going to have to pitch down slightly to compensate, keep the speed around about 80, as close to 80 as I can make it. Starting to come round on the centre line. Golf Bravo Zulu final, runway 02 to land. Red, blues, greens, assuming we get our landing clearance. Clear to land 02. Clear to land 02, Golf Bravo Zulu. Continue. Speed's coming up a little bit. I think we've got plenty of height now, so I'm going to start cranking in 2 stages of flaps. And finally the 3rd stage. Pitching down to compensate, and then at the last minute, I check the descent with some pitch. And flare and hold. Lovely. Not a bad attempt, if I do say so myself. We'll let the aircraft roll, we don't need any braking. One of the strange things about this airplane, it seems to slow down very, very easily at idle throttle, so I kind of have to keep quite a bit of power on. That's something that the real aircraft definitely doesn't do. It's idle power, the aircraft's still really making enough thrust to keep it rolling along if it's a flat surface. We'll vacate here, so this is taxiway Bravo. So we've not done bad off a glide approach to make it off on Bravo. I'm not going to touch anything about the configuration of the aircraft till we're fully vacated. It's a very important one, especially on your CPL test. Okay, we're vacated. So now I'm going to roll our after landing checks. Now students, normally I'd say stop, get your checklist out, do it properly. If air traffic, as long as you've informed air traffic that that's what you're doing. As somebody who's very, very familiar with these aircraft, I usually do them as almost like a flow on a commercial aircraft. So I'll go across with the grey switches, knock all of these off apart from the beacon light. So that's the fuel pump, the lights and the pitot heat. Transponder can come off. The flaps can come up. And we'd set our trim to neutral. I can't really see it, so I'll leave that. And we'll continue the taxi. Very important, obviously, that you make sure you're taxiing in a straight line and you're not going to hit anything before you start messing around with stuff in the cockpit. It's a very easy way to bash your airplane into stuff if you start focusing on things inside, which is why I only recommend doing that if you're a a moderately experienced pilot who's knowledgeable of his aircraft and basically can compress all the buttons without really having to take your viewpoint away from the windscreen. All of you newly qualified PPLs out there, definitely recommend stopping, whipping your checklist out and doing it properly. And as I struggle to maintain control on this taxiway, we come to another of my pet hates, so taxiing too fast. You see it all the time with GA pilots. They seem to think the faster they taxi, the more professional they look, and in reality it's the complete opposite. You just look like an absolute moron going around corners on 2 wheels, like a drunk Reliant Robin. So any of you real pilots out there listening, don't taxi too fast. You look like an idiot, or the experienced pilots will be laughing at you and waiting for you to tip over. So in real life on the taxi in here, if I was in charge of the aeroplane, obviously I'd been concentrating on the taxi. If I was the instructor, sitting on the right hand side, I'd be using this opportunity to maybe make a few notes about how the student did, some learning points for the next lesson, taking note of the times. And this aircraft, we've got a Hobbs meter on this side here, so I might be making a note of that, but usually wait until the end because it does keep ticking over as long as the engine is running. Slow down nicely for this turn onto the Echo taxiway. Scenery, by the way, is UK 2000 Doncaster. Can definitely recommend this. Really does look like the real place. Apart from the Hunter there. There isn't a Hunter there in real life, it's just all disused. There were a couple of old Citations parked there actually, until about a year ago, I think last Christmas, or about Christmas ago, they took them away somewhere, hopefully to get restored to fly again. So I'm just going to swing around and park up in these spots. Normally light aircraft, Doncaster on the Foxtrot apron park there, the based aircraft. Non-based aircraft, get to park in the middle. But because obviously we're VIPs here at Fly From Home, we're going to park in the VIP spot. Get some ground handling off of the airport handling agents, get them to come out and drive us the 5 or 10 metres to the security gate in their nice fancy van. Right, there we go. And stop, we'll put the parking brake on, and then we'll reset 1200 RPM. So again, students, you should be getting your checklists out for your shutdown checks at this point. Normally if this was a real aeroplane, I'd probably get my checklist out as well, really, but I can pretty much remember what to do off by heart. So we'd flick off the radios, the ADF and the DME there. Transponder's already off. The comm radio here can go off. The nav radio here can go off. This nav radio and this comm radio, assuming all relevant radio calls have been made. We're just going to do a quick check of the magnetos. So left, both, right, both, just making sure that we do get an RPM drop to indicate that that switch is still working. We've not got an earthing problem with that. And just before we shut down, we're going to idle throttle, and then we're going to bring the mixture all the way back. Not that one, that one. There we go. Once the prop's fully stopped, we turn the mags off, and then we also turn off the batteries. I've got the sound of the gyros running down there. Okay, and that's it really. So hopefully that's been a moderately interesting and informative little flight. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments. And if you didn't enjoy it, still comment and just call me an idiot. I'm obviously a masochist because I enjoy flying around with Jim, and he just does nothing but insult me most of the time. So please feel free. Just drop something in there, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Cheers, take care.